This chapter is called The Role of Material Culture. And I initially was kind of puzzled by the title of the chapter, The Role of Material Culture. That sounds kind of weird. Like, what do you mean the role of material culture? Kind of like it's playing a part in a play on stage or something. But after reading Connor's contribution, I thought, well, maybe they're correct in the sense that we are increasingly questioning what is the role of material culture at a time when, all right, Connor, tell us about those NFTs.
So legally they will. They're essentially that all the same. Usually the style of animal. One that's most prevalent that convention.
Huh.
So those tokens of like monkeys with different things. Actually, the rights are going for these are entirely digital art that people are only really buying a receipt to have. You don't know what they said, but you got a receipt and not the actual painting.
It is kind of, it's really calling into question a whole bunch of things about, you know, exactly this idea, the role of material culture. Do you need to have the thing? Apparently, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe the thing is not a thing. And so apparently we are able to sell the rights to a digital token that this is an original. For example, I think the founder of Twitter sold the first tweet. I think he got like $2 million for it or something. He did give it away. Jonathan's shaking his head. The first tweet. Actually, one of my favorite tweets on this was saying that I've done this great thing where I can, a hacker trick of the right click save, and my digital portfolio is now worth $19 trillion because all of these things that are being bought and sold are digital. And so apparently you can have on your hard drive or even in the cloud an exact copy of the same thing that somebody else has paid monkeys for, lots of monkeys, which is really, I don't know how this is going to end. As I told you with Bitcoin, it's not, I mean, the thing is value is created because we all believe it and we kind of agree to it. You know, well, let's take even housing prices. Like our house, my house in Oneonta might be worth, oh, we're going up in Oneonta. Let us say it is worth $200,000. But if we move the same house, I don't know, 3 hours south to outside of New York City, all of a sudden we're worth like $2 million. My parents, they live outside of around Bellevue in you know, what has become this very weird, trendy Microsoft land and Amazon land. And people are they're buying $1 million houses just to tear them down and build other things on them. So it's a strange time in the time of material culture. We're starting to wonder what the role of material culture is, if we will ever need it again, if people are just going to digitize everything and that's how we'll live. On the other hand, the price of stuff, as you might have noticed, gas, food, things that we need seems to be going up. Not sure how many digital tokens I can pay for these things to actually be able to buy my soup and stuff. So these are strange times. There are paradoxical times. Again, anthropologists have always insisted that value, I mean, people place value in things that don't seem to maybe necessarily have any real true value. They don't even have to be, well, let's go into the chapter a little bit. How Elizabeth Brumfield talks about how a lot of the things that have been created, this is on page 379. What often drives human creativity is not in fact necessity, but play or the need for competitive prestige. Ah, the need for competitive prestige. That sounds like owning the first tweet or owning the first jumping monkey or other kinds of things, right? Play and competitive prestige. So this may be a driving factor. It may have always been a driving factor. On the other hand, yes, it sure doesn't look like all these things are going to turn out well. I can't recommend them to you as investments, but you don't come here for investment advice. No. All right, so in the role of material culture chapter, we then get into some archaeology stuff. And I think this comes up here a little bit more than, or I guess I would say, in comparison to US anthropology. In US anthropology, we split anthropology up into 4 fields, and we take biological anthropology and archaeology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and we kind of have 4 different classes or subjects for them that you study. Whereas in the UK, the lines are a little bit less drawn. I mean, if you're going to be in archaeology or biological, you're probably just going to be part of the larger anthropology department or off on your own. So I think that's why it comes up here as opposed to where it might come up in a different kind of classroom. And I'm sure many of you, no, I'm not sure many of you, I'm sure many of you, yes, have taken a separate archaeology class. I'm not going to talk a ton about the archaeology stuff, but it is something that comes up in this section. I want to talk specifically, though, about a professor of mine who comes up, I think, is the first cite in this chapter, and I've already taken something from her work on page 379, but on page 375 is where Elizabeth Brumfield comes up, very famous archaeologist, and really in some ways pioneered the study of how archaeologists looked at gender and gender in the historical record. Also for me, I was just delighted to see Professor Brumfield here because she taught for a very, very long time at Albion College in Michigan. And there I was, a recent PhD out in Michigan. My wife was getting her degree at the University of Michigan. We were living in Ann Arbor, needed something to do. And this small teaching job opened up at Albion College. And so I got to meet Professor Brumfield, and then she later gave me some more stuff. I would say that she's probably one of the main reasons that I was able to at all become a teacher and a professor. So you can blame her for nobody coming to class. But great person, really interesting. Again, pioneered the role of gender, passed away, as you can see, too early, just as she had moved to Northwestern University. We were able to bring her here for a talk once, which was very well attended, great speaker too, really just a nice, a good person as well as a great archaeologist. So her contribution here, in addition to really being a fabulous archaeologist of things in the Aztec area and the people who had been subordinated to the Aztec, was really looking at the role of gender and bringing people together to talk about something that archaeologists probably hadn't talked about that much. And how do you look at gender in the historical record? I think for the most part, her contribution is what we would call kind of the classic feminist archaeology today, in that it was looking at relationships of power along this binary between male and female in the historical record. Your text also mentions And this is an article from a different archaeologist, but the material that they mention is by Megan Wally about potential archaeological expressions of non-binary gender in pre-contact Inuit contexts. And I bring this up because we talked about how people have been sort of pushing the boundaries of gender and trying to think about gender in a non-binary way in today's world, but it also has helped archaeologists push the boundaries of gender in looking back at past artifacts, which were often simply divided into the binary because everybody assumed that our binary just went back in time, when in fact, we don't know that. And it may be that our own gender binary, we were imposing that upon the archaeological record. And this has caused people to re-examine a lot of those figurines and other things that people simply classified as male or female, and start to think about how other peoples as well probably didn't have, at least definitely not the same gender binary that we have, but may not have had a gender binary. So we're starting to learn a lot about this in archaeology, and I think this is one of the key places where the material culture and the archaeology kind of unites and is able to influence each other as we look back at the complexities of prehistory. I want to also talk here about why the material culture of material matters to me. In some ways, it's often also because what we're talking about when we talk about material culture is economics and producing things, distributing things that a lot of people don't feel falls within the realm of culture anymore. And one of the things about the definition of culture that has been, I think, problematic is that most people see culture as beliefs, ideas, religion, those kinds of things. They don't see it as influencing the stuff we produce, the food we eat, our economic distribution system, and those kinds of issues. And so I think that beyond simply archaeology, thinking about the materiality of culture and how it is instantiated is hugely important for continuing to argue for this larger role for culture than it has perhaps been given in many of our ideas about it, which makes it very, very mental. Along those lines, we see the work, they discuss the work here going back to a person we've heard about before, Bourdieu, and the idea of the house and the home, and actually that big word from before, the habitus, comes back up here, and I dug back into our previous slides. We're talking about this, it was a long time ago, the body. You may remember talking about the body and the techniques of the body and how we train the body. And I gave you this impenetrable quote from Bourdieu, the habitus, the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations, which is hard to understand, but I think it makes sense if you think about body techniques. How are we talking about how you get culturally trained to have your fork on one side and your knife and spoon on the other, and the mannerisms that you have and the greetings and your postures and your walking. And then you combine that with the material culture of, in this case, this is a very famous diagram from Bourdieu, the plan of the Kabyle house, or the Berber house, in which your body has been trained, but you're also oriented when you come into the house so that all kinds of things always happen on the left side and other things happen on the right side. And so your body is also being oriented within a kind of general idea of how a house should look and how things should be laid out, and what you see first and what is at the back and what is in the light and what is in the dark. And so what Bourdieu was trying to figure out is, how is it possible that we can all have sort of complete autonomy and be able to do our own thing, improvise, yet it seems to constantly be in line with the structure and the kinds of things that have come before us, and so that the society gets reproduced. So how is it possible that we can be actors, we can be agents, we can be doing things, but also in some ways reproducing that which had gone before? And so that's what he was trying to get at. And we talked about how is the habitus simply culture? It is, I believe, if culture includes material culture, the body techniques and all these things. And you can kind of, I think, see it a little better here with how it coincides with how people might have ideals of houses, how they are instantiated, and so how you could live in a certain space, feel yourself to be completely, I don't know if completely free is the correct word, but able to do things, and yet sort of reproducing what has gone before. We're all perhaps hopefully going off to places where we'll have these gatherings, these Thanksgiving gatherings, and you're doing something in the moment, but at the same time drawing upon these older ideals and ideas about what has gone before. A durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations. So how we can improvise within a whole set of rules that have been laid down before. I was starting to wonder if this chapter belongs earlier, in fact, if it belongs back with the body stuff in talking about archaeology and materials, but good reviewer here. Good review here. Of course, whenever we talk about houses, we have to think about the dirt and how they become dirty. I thought I should give you this, one of the most famous quotes in anthropology from Mary Douglas about what dirt is. Dirt is matter out of place. And so what Mary Douglas was in some ways trying to say is that whether we see things as dirt or whether we see things as in need of cleaning is a cultural construct. Dirt, she explains, is not something absolute. Rather, it is a cultural construct that makes clear the categories of any given culture. Any material that falls outside the boundaries of the classification system of a specific culture is dirt or dirty, thereby reaffirming the validity, naturalness, and purity of that which remains within the boundary. Ah, there we go. Some boundaries too, right? So, I mean, it's just really interesting to think about when things start to fall outside of where they're supposed to be, and what happens when you find when you're clipping your fingernails, and that's fine because your fingernails are on your body, but what happens when you find somebody else's fingernails and they haven't thrown them away, right? Matter out of place all of a sudden. It's shouldn't be there anymore. Or I guess what happens as soon as you clip those fingernails off your fingernails, edge of your fingernails. Okay, so dirt is matter out of place. Of course, that's not dirt there, that's soil, which is, they talk about soil as a material object, and the role that, really interesting material about how soil in some places is the stuff of life for indigenous peoples, so that their houses are made from earth, is on page 384, as are their cooking pots, and their labor puts them in direct contact with the soil. They wear sandals or bare feet, versus people who, non-Indigenous people who distance themselves from the earth by riding in cars, living in houses made of bricks, using metal cooking pots, and wearing shoes that they say have minimum contact with the earth. Right? So again, here, this idea of where where your place is and what is the role of those materials, and are you trying to draw yourself into in relationship to the natural world and its materials, or are you trying to establish a separation between them? There's also some really interesting stuff in this chapter about how anthropologists tried to put a bunch of stuff in museums for a while, but then that was not a great idea, and so tried not to do that. And sort of some of the efforts that people have made in museums to not be so, how to say, taking objects and simply displaying them, to go for, as I said on page 392, many museums work closely with the groups they represent to ensure that they participate in deciding how they might be represented, and talking about the role of performance and those kinds of things. How's that going, Gabe? How are museums doing these days in your estimation?
Probably just way better than the past. Like repatriation is like a big thing now. Museums like are starting to have like more like groups inside the museum that are like solely focused on repatriation. So that's like a great thing.
I think the Jaeger Museum is a really good example of a transition that was made between the original Jaeger guy, who, I don't know, man, he seemed pretty extractive to me. I'm not sure. Yeah, is that true? Yeah, he sounds right up there with the extractivists. So, you know, but to make a thoughtful transition, to be more attentive to repatriation, to the extent that even bringing in one of those guest speakers who talked about, remember the land acknowledgements and what we might be able to do in relationship to our indigenous extraction of indigenous stuff. So yeah, interesting stuff there. And then I wanted to also bring your attention to some ideas that have come up recently. I used to teach this book in cultural anthropology, but it's a little too much, a little too hard at the end of the year to put this book in there. It's a book by Tim Ingold, who gets discussed on page 380, called Making: Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture, what he called the 4 A's. But was about, in some ways, how, as I say here, instead of simply looking at stuff and looking at how people maybe even the innovation of anthropology was not just to look at the stuff, but to try and figure out how people made things, to actually try to make those things yourself and see what happens. And what this has kind of led to is the idea that a lot of the things that we take to be artworks, for many of the people that are doing the art, the goal is not necessarily the end piece. The goal is the process itself. And so if we think about something like dance or music as art, it doesn't ever become materialized as a thing. It's the process of the dance itself. It's the process of actually playing the music. I mean, obviously these things get materialized as sort of written choreographs or written scores, but they don't actually come to life, and they come to life differently every time that they are played. And so that process is perhaps the most important thing, not necessarily the product that could endure through time. We think about this in terms, we think that in some ways paintings or drawings or these things produce a product which can be hung on the wall. But in many societies, like dance or music, the point was to make the painting, to do the drawing. I think with this is seen perhaps in Chinese calligraphy. In some ways, it's the process of doing that, not necessarily the final work. I think there are other traditions where there's sort of this elaborate sand art, which is then, immediately destroyed. Is Gabe shaking his head? Yes. Does this ring a bell?
Yeah, it's mandalas.
Okay, right. So yeah, I mean that in some ways it's the actual it's sort of performance of what is done that is more important or what is prioritized rather than some sort of finished product which you could buy, sell, hang on a wall. So I think this is again a kind of exciting way to think about artistic stuff, about what we do in museums, about the role of material culture.